Judge Richard Keller walked into the courtroom with a confident smile. Everyone stood up as he entered. He was a man in his late 50s with gray hair and cold blue eyes. For 15 years, he had ruled this small-town courtroom like his personal kingdom. "Good morning, everyone. Please be seated," he said, adjusting his black robe. His voice carried authority that no one dared to question. The courtroom was busy that Monday morning. Police officers stood in small groups, talking and laughing. They felt at home here. This was a place where they always won. Officer Mike Davis nodded at the judge, and Judge Keller winked back. Their friendship was no secret in town. They played golf together on weekends and attended the same social events. Many people in town whispered that this was why the police never lost a case in Judge Keller's court. First case, called the court clerk. A young black man named Jamal Thompson was brought in. He looked nervous and tired. The charges against him were for possession of marijuana, a small amount that would barely get a slap on the wrist in the next county. But here, in Judge Keller's courtroom, everyone knew Jamal was facing serious time. "Mr. Thompson, you are charged with possession of a controlled substance. How do you plead?" Judge Keller asked, barely looking at Jamal. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Jamal said quietly. Officer Davis stepped forward with a smile. "Your Honor, we found the drugs in the defendant's car during a routine traffic stop. Clear case." The public defender, a young woman who looked overwhelmed with her caseload, tried to speak. "Your Honor, my client maintains that." "Save it for the trial." Judge Keller cut her off. "Bail is set at $5,000. Next case." The officers chuckled as Jamal was led away. His family couldn't afford that bail, and everyone knew it. As the morning went on, the pattern repeated. Every person of color who came before the judge received harsh treatment. White defendants got lighter sentences or had their cases dismissed with warnings. In the back of the courtroom sat a woman no one had noticed before. Maya Johnson observed everything quietly. She was dressed simply in a navy blue suit. Her natural hair was styled neatly, and she wore minimal jewelry. Nothing about her stood out, which was exactly what she wanted. Maya watched as Judge Keller took a short break. He stepped down from the bench and walked over to chat with the police officers. They'd all laughed together like old friends. "That Thompson kid won't see daylight for months," one officer said. "Good work on that arrest, Mike," Judge Keller said, patting Officer Davis on the back. "One more troublemaker off our streets." They didn't notice Maya taking notes in a small notebook. They didn't see her discreetly recording their conversation on her phone. They had no idea who she was or why she was there. During lunch break, Maya stepped outside the courthouse. She made a phone call, speaking quietly. "It's worse than we thought," she said to the person on the other end. "The bias is obvious. The judge and officers are openly celebrating together after each case." She listened for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I'll continue observing for the rest of the day. Tomorrow, I'll be appearing before him on that minor traffic ticket we arranged. That's when we'll move to phase 2. Maya hung up and took a deep breath. As a black woman in this small town, she knew the risks she was taking. But as someone with power these men couldn't imagine, she was ready to bring their corrupt system crashing down. She returned to the courtroom, just another face in the crowd. For now, the afternoon session began with Judge Keller looking refreshed after his lunch. He had dined with Officer Davis and 2 other officers at the expensive stagehouse across from the courthouse. They'd all returned together, laughing about something as they entered the building. Maya Johnson remained in her seat at the back of the courtroom. She had eaten a quick sandwich on a bench outside, not wanting to miss anything important. During lunch, she had sent several text messages to her team with updates about the morning's events. "Next case, State versus Williams," announced the court clerk. Shanice Williams was brought into the courtroom. She was a young black woman, maybe 25 years old, who looked exhausted and scared. Her hands shook as she stood before the judge. "Ms. Williams, you are charged with writing bad checks. How do you plead?" Judge Keller asked without looking up from his papers. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Shanice said. Her voice was barely audible. "I didn't know the checks would bounce. I lost my job and—" "Save your story," Judge Keller interrupted. "This court isn't interested in excuses." Maya noticed how differently the judge spoke to Shanice compared to the white businessman who had appeared earlier on similar charges but was treated with respect and understanding. Officer Wilson, a heavy-set man with a crew cut, stepped forward. Your Honor, this isn't Ms. Williams' first offense. We have records of previous financial crimes. Shanice's public defender tried to object. Your Honor, those were minor incidents from 7 years ago, when my client was barely 18. She's been clean since then and is a single mother of 2 children. Judge Keller waved his hand dismissively. Bail is set at $3,000. Next case. Shanice began to cry. Please, Your Honor, I can't afford that. My children. Remove the defendant, Judge Keller ordered, and the bailiff led Shanice away. As she passed by Maya, their eyes met briefly. Maya gave her a small, reassuring nod that no one else noticed. When the next case was called, Judge Keller's demeanor changed completely. A white college student named Brad Miller was charged with drunk driving and property damage. The judge smiled warmly. Young man, everyone makes mistakes, Judge Keller said kindly. I understand you're on the football team at State College. Yes, sir, Brad replied. Good program. I'm an alumnus myself, the judge said. I think community service would be appropriate here. Let's say 40 hours and a fine of $200. Officer Davis, who had arrested Brad, nodded in agreement. The two exchanged friendly looks. Maya wrote something in her notebook, then took out her phone and sent a quick text. The pattern continued throughout the afternoon. White defendants received leniency, while black and Hispanic defendants faced harsh penalties for lesser crimes. At the end of the session, Judge Keller called Officer Davis to the bench. Maya moved to a seat closer to them, pretending to search for something in her bag while listening carefully. Good day today, Judge Keller said quietly. That Williams woman will probably plead guilty now. They always do when bail is set high. One less problem in the neighborhood. Officer Davis agreed with a chuckle. Hey, are we still on for poker Friday night at your place? Absolutely. Bring that good whiskey you had last time. Maya had heard enough. She slipped out of the courtroom and made a call from the hallway. I need all the case files for the last 5 years, she said into her phone. The pattern is clear, but we need the numbers to back it up. As she ended the call, Maya checked her watch. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., she would appear before Judge Keller on her traffic violation. The corrupt judge had no idea what was coming. Maya walked to her hotel, mentally preparing for the next day. Phase 2 of the operation was about to begin, and it would shake this courthouse to its foundation. The next morning, the courthouse was buzzing with activity. Judge Keller arrived early, stopping to chat with the security guards at the entrance. They laughed at his jokes and moved aside quickly to let him pass without checking his briefcase. Maya Johnson arrived 15 minutes before her scheduled hearing. She wore a simple black dress with a gray cardigan. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried a warm leather bag. To anyone looking, she appeared to be just another nervous defendant preparing to face the judge. Good morning, Judge. Officer Davis called out as he entered the courtroom with 3 other officers. Beautiful day, isn't it? Judge Keller smiled broadly. Indeed it is, Mike. How's that case against Thompson coming along? Solid as a rock, Officer Davis replied. He'll take a plea deal by the end of the week. We found more evidence in his apartment yesterday. Maya sat quietly, watching the friendly exchange. She noticed how other people waiting for their cases to be heard watched with expressions ranging from confusion to resignation. This behavior from a judge was highly inappropriate, yet it seemed to be the normal routine here. The first few cases proceeded as usual. A Hispanic man was given a harsh sentence for driving without a license. A white woman received a warning for the same offense. The officers nodded approvingly after each of the judge's decisions. At 10:30 a.m., a young black man named Marcus Johnson appeared before the judge. He was accused of stealing from a local store. The security camera clearly shows the defendant taking the items, Officer Wilson stated firmly. Marcus's lawyer spoke up. Your Honor, my client was actually returning items to the shelf, not taking them. If we could show the full video. That won't be necessary, Judge Keller interrupted. The officer's testimony is sufficient. The officers standing at the back of the courtroom exchanged satisfied smiles. One of them gave a thumbs up to Officer Wilson. Your Honor, Marcus tried to speak. I was just. Silence. Judge Keller banged his gavel. One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt. Bail is set at $2,000. As Marcus was led away, Judge Keller turned to the officers with a smile. "Another case closed. Good work, gentlemen." The officers approached the bench, and one of them handed the judge a small paper bag. "My wife made those cookies you like, Judge," he said loudly enough for Maya to hear. "How thoughtful," Judge Keller replied. "Tell her I said thanks." During a short recess, the judge and officers gathered in a corner of the courtroom, speaking in low voices but laughing loudly. They seemed completely unconcerned about who might be watching them. Maya took out her phone and discreetly took photos of the gathering. She then sent a text message to someone. When court resumed, Judge Keller seemed in an even better mood. "Next case," he called out. "State versus Johnson, Your Honor." "Traffic violation," the clerk announced. Maya stood up and walked forward confidently. For the first time that day, Judge Keller actually looked at a defendant properly. Something about Maya's calm demeanor caught his attention. "Ms. Johnson, you are charged with running a red light on Main Street. How do you plead?" he asked, studying her face. "Before I enter my plea, Your Honor, I'd like to address the court," Maya said clearly. Judge Keller frowned. "This is a simple traffic case, Ms. Johnson. Just enter your plea." "I understand, Your Honor, that there's something important the court should know first." The officers at the back of the room started paying attention. Something about this woman was different from the usual defendants. "Fine," Judge Keller said impatiently. "Make it quick." Maya took a deep breath. The moment she had been preparing for had arrived. What happened next would change everything in this courthouse forever. "Thank you, Your Honor," Maya said, standing tall before the court. Her voice was steady and clear, much stronger than it had been moments ago. "I would like to introduce myself properly." Judge Keller leaned forward, annoyed by this unusual start to a simple traffic case. "Ms. Johnson, this court doesn't have time for." "My name is Maya Johnson," she continued, ignoring his attempt to cut her off. "But I am not here about a traffic violation." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Officer Davis straightened up from his relaxed position against the wall, suddenly alert. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out an official-looking identification card. "I am Deputy Attorney General Maya Johnson from the State Justice Department, Civil Rights Division." The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Keller's face froze in shock. "What is the meaning of this?" he finally managed to say, his voice no longer carrying its usual authority. Maya placed a folder on the table in front of her. "For the past 3 days, I have been observing the proceedings in this courtroom as part of an official investigation into reports of judicial misconduct and systematic discrimination." Officer Davis stepped forward. "Your Honor, perhaps we should discuss this in your chambers." "Stay where you are, Officer Davis," Maya said firmly, turning to face him. "This is now an open investigation, and it will be conducted here, in public view." The other officers looked at each other nervously. The court clerk stopped typing, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. "This is outrageous." Judge Keller's face turned red. "I have been serving on this bench for 15 years with an impeccable record." Maya opened her folder and pulled out several documents. "Our office has received numerous complaints about patterns of racial bias in sentencing, improper relationships between the court and law enforcement, and violation of defendants' constitutional rights." She turned to address the whole courtroom. "What I have witnessed over the past 3 days confirms these allegations." People in the gallery began whispering to each other. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked confused and shocked. "I have documented 27 cases in just 3 days where defendants of color received significantly harsher treatment than white defendants charged with similar offenses," Maya continued. "I have also recorded multiple instances of inappropriate communication between Your Honor and the police officers." Judge Keller banged his gavel loudly. "This is a complete fabrication. I will not stand for this in my courtroom." "It is no longer your courtroom, Judge Keller," Maya replied calmly. She pulled out an official document with the state seal clearly visible. "By order of the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, you are temporarily removed from the bench pending a full investigation." The document shook slightly in Judge Keller's hand as he read it. His face grew pale. "This cannot be legal," he whispered. "I assure you, it is completely legal," Maya said. "And there's more." At that moment, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 3 people in suits entered, 2 men and a woman. They walked confidently toward the front of the room. These are state investigators who will be reviewing all case files from the past 5 years, Maya explained. They will also be conducting interviews with defendants, court staff, and law enforcement officers. Officer Davis tried to move toward the exit, but one of the investigators blocked his path. No one is to leave, Maya instructed. This investigation begins now. The public defender who had tried so hard to defend her clients over the past few days stood up with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly to Maya. Judge Keller slumped in his chair, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. The power he had abused for so long was being stripped away in front of everyone. Maya turned to face the shocked officers. "Gentlemen, I suggest you prepare for a very thorough review of your conduct. This is only the beginning." Chaos erupted in the courtroom. People stood up, talking loudly and pointing at Judge Keller and the officers. The bailiff tried to restore order, but his voice was lost in the commotion. "Silence," Maya called out firmly. Her voice, though not as loud as Judge Keller's typical bellows, carried a natural authority that immediately quieted the room. Judge Keller's face had turned from red to ashen white. He looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice shaking. "I have friends in the state capitol. One phone call and—" "Your friends are already aware of this investigation," Maya interrupted. She pulled out her phone and showed him a screen with a list of names. "In fact, several of them provided valuable information about your activities." Officer Davis stepped forward aggressively. "You can't just come in here and—" "Officer Davis," Maya cut him off. "May I remind you that interfering with a state investigation is a serious offense, one that could result in immediate suspension." The other officers grabbed Davis's arm, pulling him back. They whispered urgently to him, and he finally backed down, though his eyes burned with anger. Maya turned to address the people in the courtroom. "For those of you waiting for your cases to be heard today, I apologize for the disruption. Court proceedings will be suspended for the remainder of the day. Please see the clerk to reschedule your hearings." She then spoke directly to those who had been unfairly treated. "If you believe your case was handled unjustly in this court, please speak with one of our investigators before you leave. We want to hear your stories." Several people immediately moved toward the investigators, eager to share their experiences. Maya returned her attention to Judge Keller, who now sat slumped in his chair, all his arrogance gone. "Judge Keller, please surrender your robes and vacate the bench. You'll regret this," he muttered, but his threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. As Judge Keller removed his robe, a young woman approached Maya. It was Shanice Williams, the single mother who had been unable to pay her bail the day before. "Ms. Johnson," Shanice said hesitantly, "does this mean I can go home to my children?" Maya smiled kindly. "Yes, Ms. Williams. A state judge will review all recent cases, including yours, by tomorrow morning. I expect you'll be home very soon." Tears filled Shanice's eyes. "Thank you. No one has ever stood up for people like us in this town." Meanwhile, the investigators had begun securing the judge's computer and files. One of them approached Maya with a concerned expression. "Ms. Johnson, we found something interesting already," she said quietly. "There appears to be a pattern in the financial records. The same defendants who received harsh sentences often had their property seized and sold at auction." "And let me guess," Maya replied, "those auctions were attended by the same small group of buyers." The investigator nodded, "Including businesses owned by Judge Keller's brother-in-law." Maya shook her head. The corruption ran even deeper than she had suspected. Officer Davis watched this exchange from across the room, his expression growing more worried by the second. He whispered something to Officer Wilson, who quickly left the courtroom. Maya noticed this and signaled to one of her team members to follow him. At the back of the courtroom, reporters had begun to gather. Word of the dramatic events had spread quickly through the small town. Maya approached Judge Keller one last time before he was escorted out. "This town deserved better," she said simply. For the first time, Judge Keller had no response. As Maya turned to address the growing crowd of reporters and concerned citizens, she caught sight of Jamal Thompson being led back into the courtroom by one of her colleagues. His confused expression turned to amazement as he realized what was happening. The fight for justice was just beginning. But for the first time in years, the scales in this courthouse were starting to balance. The next morning, the local newspaper's headline read, Statey Investigation Rocks County KUSE. Photos of Judge Keller being escorted from the building appeared on the front page. The town was buzzing with the news. Maya arrived at the courthouse early. She had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing case files with her team. What they found disturbed her deeply. Hundreds of cases showed clear patterns of discrimination, with sentences for Black and Hispanic defendants averaging 3 times longer than those for white defendants charged with identical crimes. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson," said Terry, the court clerk who had worked under Judge Keller for 7 years. She looked nervous but determined. "I have something I think you should see." Terry handed Maya a USB drive. "These are recordings of meetings Judge Keller held with officers in his chambers. You didn't know I could hear everything through the vent in the file room. I've been saving these for years, waiting for someone like you to come." Maya placed a hand on Terry's shoulder. "Thank you for your courage. This will help many people." By 9:00 a.m., the courthouse was packed. A temporary judge sent by the state Supreme Court had arrived to handle urgent cases. Judge Sandra Wilson was in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that didn't miss a thing. "First case," she announced. State versus Jamal Thompson. Jamal stood before the new judge, looking confused but hopeful. "I've reviewed this case," Judge Wilson said. "The search of Mr. Thompson's vehicle appears to have been conducted without proper cause or consent. Case dismissed." Officer Davis, who was required to be present, stood with his arms crossed and jaw clenched tight. "Your Honor," Maya said, rising from her seat. "The state requests that Mr. Thompson's record be immediately expunged." "Granted," Judge Wilson replied without hesitation. Jamal's family, sitting in the gallery, broke into tears of relief. One by one, Judge Wilson reviewed the most urgent cases. 17 people who had been unfairly detained were released before noon. Each dismissal seemed to drive Officer Davis further into rage. During a short recess, Maya received an urgent call from one of her investigators. "We found something in Officer Wilson's locker," the investigator said. "A bag containing drugs and what appears to be planted evidence for several cases." "Secure it and document everything," Maya instructed. "And put a watch on all exits from the building." When court resumed, Officer Davis was missing. An investigator approached Maya and whispered in her ear. "He was seen entering the evidence room 10 minutes ago. He's still in there." Maya nodded and quietly left the courtroom. She walked briskly to the evidence room, accompanied by 2 state officers. Through the small window in the door, they could see Officer Davis frantically searching through boxes. Maya opened the door. "Looking for something, Officer Davis?" Davis spun around, his hand moving toward his gun. "I wouldn't," warned one of the state officers, his own weapon already drawn. "Hands where we can see them." Davis slowly raised his hands. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, trying to sound calm. "I'm just reviewing evidence for an upcoming case." "Is that why you're sweating so much?" Maya asked. "Or is it because you realized we're checking evidence against case reports and finding major discrepancies?" Davis's face hardened. "You have no idea what it's like policing these streets. Sometimes corners need to be cut for the greater good." "The greater good?" Maya repeated. "Was it for the greater good when you planted evidence on Marcus Johnson, or when you testified falsely in dozens of cases?" She nodded to the state officers. "Take him to the holding room. He's not to speak with any of the other officers." As Davis was led away, Maya's phone rang again. It was her supervisor from the state capitol. "How deep does this go?" he asked. Maya watched through the window as more officers were brought in for questioning. "All the way to the top," she answered. "The mayor's signature is on documents approving asset seizures from defendants who weren't even convicted yet." "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Johnson," her supervisor said. "Be careful." Maya thought about Shanice Williams reuniting with her children that morning, about Jamal Thompson walking free, about years of injustice finally being addressed. "Some nests need stirring," she replied firmly. 3 days after Maya revealed her true identity, the small town of Riverdale was transformed. State investigators had taken over the police station and courthouse. 8 officers, including Davis and Wilson, had been suspended pending criminal charges. Judge Keller remained under house arrest, his passport confiscated. Maya sat in what used to be the judge's chambers, now her temporary office. Stacks of case files covered every surface. Each file represented a person whose life had been damaged by corruption. A knock at the door interrupted her work. "Come in," she called. Terry, the court clerk, entered, carrying a thick folder. "Ms. Johnson, I found more records hidden in a storage room. These go back 10 years. Maya took the folder gratefully. "You've been invaluable, Terry. Have you considered what we discussed yesterday?" Terry nodded. "Yes, I'll testify. It's time people knew the truth." After Terry left, Maya received an unexpected visitor. Mayor Frank Collins walked in without knocking, his usual confident smile replaced by a concerned frown. "Ms. Johnson, I think it's time we had a chat," he said, closing the door behind him. "This investigation is damaging our town's reputation." Maya looked at him calmly. "Your town's reputation was damaged long before I arrived, Mayor Collins. I'm just bringing the damage to light." The mayor sat down uninvited. "Look, we both know how these things work. Mistakes were made, certainly, but do we really need to drag everyone through the mud? Perhaps we could find a compromise." "Are you attempting to obstruct a state investigation, Mayor Collins?" Maya asked, pressing the record button on her phone discreetly. "Not at all," he backtracked quickly. "I'm simply suggesting a more measured approach. Judge Keller has powerful friends. This could get unpleasant for everyone involved." Maya leaned forward. "It's already unpleasant for the hundreds of people unjustly imprisoned or fined. It's been unpleasant for families torn apart by your corrupt system." She opened a file on her desk. "Tell me, Mayor Collins, why did your brother's construction company receive every contract for work on foreclosed properties seized by the court?" The mayor's face paled. "That's just good business." "That's just good corruption," Maya corrected. "And we have the paper trail." After the mayor left, looking considerably less confident, Maya was called to the courthouse where a community meeting had been arranged. The main courtroom was packed with townspeople, some angry, some hopeful, all confused about what was happening to their town. Maya stood before them, no longer hiding in the back of the room. "My name is Maya Johnson from the State Justice Department. I'm here to answer your questions about the ongoing investigation." A middle-aged white woman stood up. "My son was sentenced to 5 years for a first-time drug offense. Will his case be reviewed?" "Every case from the past decade will be reviewed," Maya assured her. "If there were irregularities, your son's sentence could be reduced or vacated entirely." Another person stood, an elderly black man leaning on a cane. "I've lived in this town for 70 years. We always knew what was happening, but nobody would listen to us. Why did it take so long for someone to come?" The room fell silent, waiting for Maya's answer. "That's a fair question," she said honestly. "The system failed you for too long. Complaints were filed but ignored. Officials looked the other way. But I promise you this, now that we know, we won't stop until justice is served." A local reporter raised his hand. "There are rumors that this investigation goes beyond Judge Keller and the police. How high up does this corruption reach?" Maya thought carefully before answering. "We follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of power or position." Just then, Maya's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at it and had to control her expression. The forensic accountants had traced payments from the mayor to Judge Keller's offshore account. Looking back at the concerned citizens before her, Maya felt the weight of their hopes. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about rebuilding an entire justice system from the ground up. "The truth is coming to light," she told them. "And when it does, this town will have a chance to start over. A chance for real justice." 6 months after Maya Johnson walked into Judge Keller's courtroom, the town of Riverdale gathered once again. This time, they filled the newly renovated community center rather than the courthouse. The mood was different, hopeful, expectant, and for many, healing. Maya stood at the podium wearing a professional blue suit. She had lost weight during these intense months, but her eyes shone with determination and satisfaction. "Today marks the conclusion of our investigation," she announced to the packed room. "I want to share the results with you directly before they become public knowledge tomorrow." The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. Former Judge Richard Keller has pleaded guilty to 27 counts of judicial misconduct, civil rights violations, and accepting bribes. He will serve 12 years in federal prison. A murmur ran through the audience. Some nodded with satisfaction, while others seemed shocked at the severity of the sentence. Officers Davis, Wilson, and 4 others have also entered guilty pleas for evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations. Their sentences range from 5 to 8 years. Maya paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. Former Mayor Collins resigned last month. Yesterday, he agreed to a plea deal that includes restitution of $1.2 million to the community and a 3-year sentence. She looked directly at the crowd now. But punishing the guilty is only half of our mission. The other half is making things right for those who suffered under this corrupt system. Maya gestured to a woman sitting in the front row. This is Judge Diana Martinez, who will be taking over as your permanent circuit court judge. She has extensive experience in civil rights law and comes highly recommended by the state Supreme Court. Judge Martinez stood and nodded respectfully to the audience. Additionally, Maya continued, 342 cases have been reviewed and overturned. Those who were wrongfully convicted have been released. Those who paid excessive fines will receive compensation. Tears flowed freely now from both black and white residents. Families who had seen loved ones imprisoned unjustly hugged each other tightly. The road to healing is long, Maya acknowledged. But today, this community takes its first real step toward justice. After the formal presentation, people lined up to speak with Maya. Jamal Thompson, now working at a local community college, shook her hand firmly. "You gave me my life back," he said simply. Janice Williams approached with her 2 children. "My kids have their mother because of you," she said, her voice breaking. "How can we ever thank you enough?" Maya smiled, kneeling down to eye level with Janice's children. "You can thank me by growing up in a world where you expect justice, not fear it." As the crowd thinned, an elderly black woman who had been waiting patiently finally approached Maya. "I'm Rose Jackson," she said. "I've lived in this town for 87 years. I never thought I'd see this day." Maya took the woman's weathered hands in hers. "I'm honored to meet you, Ms. Jackson." "I just wanted to ask you something," Rose said. "What made you take on this fight? You could have had an easier assignment." Maya thought about the question carefully. "When I was 14, my father was wrongfully convicted in a town very much like this one. He served 8 years before being exonerated. By then, my mother had died of heartbreak, and our family was destroyed." She looked around at the renewed community. "I couldn't save my own family, but maybe I helped save others." As Maya prepared to leave Riverdale the next day, she took one last look at the courthouse. A new sign had been installed, "Equal Justice Under Law." Her supervisor called as she was driving away. "Well done, Johnson. The department is impressed. There's a promotion waiting for you back at headquarters." Maya smiled but said nothing about her plans. In her briefcase was a file on another small town with suspicious patterns of sentencing. The work was far from over. As Riverdale faded in her rearview mirror, Maya knew that somewhere, her father was proud. Justice delayed was not always justice denied. Sometimes, it just needed the right person to fight for it.